6 years ago, a 6-year-old boy vanished from a quiet neighborhood in Missouri, leaving no signs of a struggle, no clear witnesses, and only a family shattered in confusion and despair. Authorities launched a large-scale investigation, examining every possibility from accident to abduction to someone known to the family, but leads gradually faded, and the case was eventually pushed into cold case status. Yet throughout those long years, the boy's family never accepted the words "no hope," still believing their son might be alive somewhere, even as that belief grew increasingly fragile over time. Then one day, from old data that seemed meaningless and an approach that hadn't existed before, a detail overlooked for years suddenly surfaced, forcing the entire case to be re-examined from the beginning. Before we dive into the story that will make you question identity, systems and truth in modern society, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next parts. In 2018, Missouri still had the feel of a peaceful Midwest region where life moved at a slow pace. Neighborhoods knew each other through casual greetings on front porches, and faith in community safety remained intact in everyday life. Evening news focused more on local economy, school sports and weather than serious crime, making the assumption that bad things don't happen here, a quiet belief shared by most families. The Harris family lived in that setting, a typical working-class family with stable routines, familiar schedules, and uncomplicated social ties. Weekdays followed the pattern of work, school, dinner, rest, while weekends were for household chores, visiting relatives, or outdoor activities near the neighborhood. In that rhythm, 6-year-old Matthew Harris was the center of every small habit, a skinny boy with hair often messy from running around, gentle and trusting in nature, used to playing within adult sight, and rarely wandering off on his own. Matthew had daily repeating interests, from carrying a familiar item when going out to returning home on time for meals. Those seemingly ordinary habits made the family believe everything was under control. The day Matthew disappeared started like any other, with no clear unusual signs to forewarn. Inside the home, activities followed the usual schedule, those present and absent aligned with daily life, and Matthew was in an environment the family considered safe. During that time, a strange detail appeared very briefly, an unfamiliar situation, a presence that caught adults' attention momentarily before they reassured themselves it was normal, and that hesitation let a moment that should have been evaluated more carefully slip by. Any initial danger signals, if present, weren't clear enough to name, let alone strong enough to shatter the existing sense of safety. The sequence of events that followed unfolded quickly but quietly. Matthew left sight for a short period, with no cries for help, no signs of disturbance, just a sudden absence. When adults turned back to look, at first the family assumed he was in a familiar hidden spot, or engrossed in play nearby, an assumption fitting past times when Matthew had briefly gone out of view. The spontaneous search began almost immediately, starting inside the house, then spreading outward, calling Matthew's name in familiar places, asking neighbors, checking entrances and nearby areas. As time passed, worry grew when initial assumptions no longer fit, and each passing minute made it clearer this wasn't a normal situation. In the first hour, the family faced very human limitations, waiting a bit longer in hope Matthew would return on his own, searching instinctively rather than systematically, and believing it could still be explained simply. Those decisions, though born from hope and daily experience, heightened the sense of helplessness as the search yielded nothing. As darkness fell and no signs emerged that Matthew was nearby, panic replaced initial confidence, forcing the family to accept the situation had exceeded their ability to handle alone. The decision to call police was made in extreme stress, marking the point when Matthew was no longer just a child lost within family bounds, but an official missing person case, opening a chain of events that, at the time, no one in the Harris family could imagine the duration and far-reaching consequences of. Immediately after the Harris family's missing person call, the case was handled under emergency procedures for children, triggering a series of professional steps in a context where time had already become critical, as each passing minute reduced the chances of quickly locating Matthew. Initial information was recorded based on the still chaotic memories of family members, from descriptions of the last sighting, the living area, people present that day, to small details not yet verified, and at that moment, the case was classified as a high-priority child missing person due to the victim's age and unclear cause. This classification led to activating a formal investigation, shifting from spontaneous search to systematic approach, where every piece of information had to be documented, cross-checked, and updated chronologically. The first investigators on scene began establishing basic markers to build an initial timeline, determining the period from when Matthew was last under family supervision to when his absence was noticed, any gaps in that chain, and environmental factors that could affect a 6-year-old's movement in the area. Establishing the timeline aimed not just to pinpoint when Matthew vanished, but to clarify how long he might have been out of sight before the family realized, as even a few minutes' discrepancy could alter the entire investigation direction. Questions focused on daily habits, fixed times Matthew usually followed, and rare exceptions that might explain why the initial absence didn't immediately alarm. Alongside building the timeline, risk assessment was conducted using standard criteria, including victim's age, self-protection ability, weather conditions, surroundings, and lack of signs indicating a short-term wandering. In Matthew's case, young age and no clear clues raised the risk level, forcing authorities to consider external intervention, though no direct evidence confirmed it yet. This risk assessment was pivotal, influencing scale and speed of resource mobilization, as well as allocation in the critical early hours when recovery chances were highest. From there, next steps shifted to proactive implementation, rather than waiting for new info. Initial resource mobilization aimed to cover the area around the last sighting as quickly as possible, combining local police and available support units to control the search space before external factors disturbed potential evidence. Access roads to the neighborhood were checked, nearby public areas prioritized, and basic Matthew info shared internally, so all involved started from the same point. In this phase, investigators faced a familiar paradox in missing persons cases: need to act fast but lack solid data, making every decision controlled speculation. Questioning the family occurred while ensuring they weren't overwhelmed by interrogation pressure, as any misunderstanding could distort info and complicate the process. As initial pieces were gathered, they were ranked by reliability, distinguishing confirmed from assumed, essential to avoid early guesses misdirecting the investigation. Simultaneously, criminal elements were cautiously considered, not to conclude but to prepare if anomalies emerged. Consistency was maintained through continuous timeline updates and risk re-evaluation with new info, as child cases can shift rapidly in hours. Factors like weather, traffic density, and community activity were viewed as variables affecting Matthew's movement or concealment of his absence. As night fell, initial mobilization not only searched but established clear authority presence, reassuring the community while deterring worse scenarios. If third-party involved, however, that presence highlighted an unavoidable reality. Despite full activation of early steps, no specific signs yet indicated Matthew's location or what happened in that short but decisive window. At the end of the launch phase, Matthew's case was in continuous monitoring, with scattered initial leads and many unanswered questions. But the shift from personal panic to official process marked a key turning point, when search responsibility moved from the Harris family alone to the entire system. One operating at maximum speed, amid challenges to time, information, and hope minute by minute. With the investigation launch activated and initial forces mobilized, focus immediately shifted to surveying the living area, where Matthew was last seen, as in child disappearances. The scene, clear or vague, is always the most vital foundation for next directions. The Harris family's neighborhood was examined systematically, starting indoors then expanding to the yard, entrances, less exits, adjacent areas, and spots a 6-year-old could reach quickly. Each was assessed with the core question: any signs of forced action? However, from the outset, a tricky reality emerged: the complete absence of typical violence signs in serious cases. No disturbed items, no struggle marks, no physical evidence of resistance or coercion from his familiar space. The lack of violent signs offered slim hope he might be safe, but posed a major challenge, eliminating visual clues that usually quickly shape the case nature. Alongside checking for violence, investigators sought direct evidence linking to the disappearance moment, from personal items, activity traces, to unusual objects in the space, but results were zero. No item oddly left behind, no signs Matthew prepared to leave, no objects suggesting third-party traces. This direct evidence absence was quickly noted as a key case feature, limiting accurate reconstruction of the critical window and forcing reliance on inference and indirect hypotheses. As survey scope expanded beyond the property, public paths, wooded areas, side roads, spaces Matthew might have passed, results remained unchanged. No leading traces, no clear info for a solid direction. Each checked area closing another possibility. In this context, scene limits became clearer, not a space where crime leaves obvious physical marks, but a normal living environment, where a child's absence could occur without disrupting surrounding order. Investigators had to acknowledge a traditional crime scene barely existed, placing Matthew's case in a particularly tough category, disappearances without clear scenes, where hypotheses build on data scarcity. Assessing scene limits wasn't to end the survey, but to realistically determine what couldn't be gathered physically. Avoiding wasted time on low-yield directions, in this balance was needed between quick action and not missing tiny details. As in such cases, a seemingly insignificant one could become key. As survey reports compiled, a preliminary case nature view formed, cautious and inconclusive. Lack of violence, direct evidence kept accident wandering, hypotheses open, but no fitting traces also prevented ruling out human intervention. This placed Matthew's case in a gray area, where usual quick classification factors were unclear, forcing broader consideration rather than narrowing. In that context, scene survey provided no answers but crucially established case realities, showing next steps would rely on building testing hypotheses over following specific traces. As initial survey phase ended, Matthew's case was in a particularly difficult state. A child vanished from familiar surroundings without physical signs, direct witnesses, or clear leads to guide investigation, making early assessments temporary and prone to change with new info. This ambiguity shaped investigators' next approaches, knowing the greatest danger in such cases isn't lack of leads, but hastily assigning an explanation to that lack too soon. When the scene, though trace poor, might still hide unseen possibilities. The remaining ambiguity after the crime scene survey forced the investigation team to restructure their approach to the case, shifting from searching for physical traces to systematizing the possibilities suggested by what was not present at the scene, as well as by Matthew's daily habits prior to his disappearance. The first focus was placed on the hypothesis that Matthew had wandered off on his own, or met with an accident, a logical approach given the absence of signs of violence and a living environment that was not overly isolated. This hypothesis rested on the possibility that a 6-year-old child could slip out of adult supervision for a short time, move instinctively or out of curiosity, and encounter a situation beyond his ability to handle. However, when comparing the wandering off hypothesis with the initial search results and the geographical limits surrounding the living area, contradictions began to emerge, as the range Matthew could have reached had been thoroughly searched without yielding any matching traces. The complete absence of any indicators related to an accident also made this hypothesis difficult to sustain as a complete explanation, though theoretically it could not yet be ruled out. From there, the investigation team was compelled to broaden their perspective to the possibility of involvement by someone known to the family, a sensitive but statistically grounded hypothesis in many child disappearance cases, where existing trust between the victim and the involved party could allow the departure to occur without drawing immediate attention. This approach required screening individuals who had recently interacted with Matthew, people who might appear in the family's daily environment, without immediately raising suspicion. Examining the known person hypothesis placed the investigation in a delicate balance, as every assessment had to be based on objective data rather than emotional speculation, while the collected information showed no clear inconsistencies in the behavior or statements of those screened. The lack of specific evidence left this hypothesis in a suspended state, not strong enough to prioritize, but impossible to fully dismiss. Alongside this, the possibility that Matthew had been abducted by a stranger was gradually incorporated into the hypothesis structure as a serious scenario that needed consideration, particularly given the rapid disappearance and lack of physical signs at the scene. This hypothesis was based on the chance that an individual outside the family or familiar community had exploited the brief moment when Matthew was unsupervised to intervene. A scenario that is notoriously hard to prove in the early stages because it typically leaves few clues. The absence of direct witnesses, data on vehicles, or suspicious behavior in the area made the stranger abduction hypothesis more of a warning than a conclusion, yet its severity required investigators to maintain it at a certain priority level to avoid overlooking the most dangerous possibility. When the three main hypotheses were placed side by side, the comparison process became a critical tool for directing the investigation, not to find an immediate answer, but to determine which hypothesis better fit the overall existing data. The wandering off hypothesis was deemed behaviorally plausible for a child, but lacked support from the scene. The known person hypothesis had statistical backing, but no specific evidence in this case. While the stranger abduction hypothesis, though hard to prove, explained the suddenness and cleanliness of the disappearance. Prioritizing hypotheses, therefore, did not involve rigid exclusion, but was implemented as an open system, where each direction was tied to specific verification steps aimed at confirming or weakening it over time. Resources were allocated based on potential risk levels and information gathering potential, while maintaining enough flexibility to adjust when new data emerged. In this process, unsuitable directions were gradually eliminated through continuous cross-checking between hypotheses and reality, as scenarios that could not account for the absence of traces, did not align with Matthew's habits, or contradicted recorded environmental factors, were downgraded in priority. Elimination did not happen abruptly, but resulted from multiple rounds of evaluation, each clarifying the limits of individual hypotheses, thereby narrowing the investigative scope without needing premature conclusions. By the end of the hypothesis-building phase, Matthew's case was placed within an analytical framework where no single explanation fully encompassed the entire event, but each possibility had been clearly positioned within the investigative structure. This very state of uncertainty reflected the complex nature of the case, while laying the groundwork for subsequent steps when hypothesis verification would become the focus rather than continuing to search a scene that left no traces. The fact that the investigative hypotheses had been placed in parallel, but none could fully explain Matthew's disappearance, immediately shifted the focus to space, treating geography as the last variable that could still be controlled before time erased all possibilities of direct tracing. The initial search area, originally limited to the Harris family's immediate neighborhood, was rapidly expanded in layers based on calculations of a 6-year-old child's potential movement in various scenarios, from wandering off in a familiar environment to being taken out of the area by an external actor. Each expanding layer involved increased manpower, equipment, and coordination between units, as the search was no longer exploratory but had become a large-scale operation under mounting time pressure. Areas close to the home were re-examined with greater detail, not only to confirm what had already been checked, but also to ensure no blind spots had been missed in the initial hours, when panic might have disrupted the systematic process. From there, the radius extended to side roads, trails, vacant lots, and areas Matthew might have reached if moving instinctively or curiously, even though that likelihood grew increasingly slim without any signs he had passed through. In the absence of physical clues, search dogs were deployed as one of the most critical tools to detect any lingering scent traces, in hopes of determining the initial direction of movement, or at least narrowing down where Matthew had been after leaving family supervision. The process followed professional standards, from selecting appropriate scent samples to deploying dogs at key marked points on the search map. However, the results provided no clear confirmation, as scent reactions were inconsistent or quickly lost in open environments where weather, traffic density, and human activity could disperse or erase traces in a short time. This not only limited tracing ability, but also raised questions about whether Matthew had moved independently in the area at all, since even short-term traces were not consistently recorded. Concurrently with the dog deployments, surrounding natural areas were prioritized in the search plan, including dense woods, riverbanks, abandoned land, and low-traffic spaces where accidents or concealment of a child's presence could occur without easy detection. Each area was assigned to specific search teams, tasked with systematically covering every meter of terrain, to rule out the possibility Matthew had met with harm there. The complex terrain and vast scope made the search time and labor intensive, while results remained unchanged, as no direct signs indicated Matthew had passed through, stopped, or encountered trouble in the checked areas. Public spaces such as parks, playgrounds, parking lots, and roads near residential areas were also searched with the same objective, but the continued absence of any specific clues further reinforced the sense that Matthew's disappearance did not follow the typical patterns search teams encounter in child wandering cases. As the search radius expanded further with zero results, time pressure became the dominant factor in every decision, since each passing hour not only reduced the chances of finding Matthew safe, but also weakened the value of any traces that might appear later. Investigators were acutely aware that the window for scene-based discoveries was closing, forcing them to reconsider the balance between continuing field searches and shifting focus to indirect investigative avenues. This pressure was amplified by expectations from the family and community, who witnessed the growing scale of the search, but saw no commensurate results, creating an unacceptable gap between effort and reality. Each time an area was declared fully searched without new traces, hope eroded a little more, while questions arose about how many possibilities had been missed in the initial hours, when everything happened too quickly. Internally among the search forces, continuing to expand the scope became a difficult equation, as overextending resources risked reducing control effectiveness and increasing the chance of overlooking details, while narrowing it meant accepting that some areas might never be thoroughly checked. The decision to maintain widespread searching was made as a final effort to ensure the relevant geography had been covered to the maximum extent, even as the likelihood of direct results grew lower. The lack of results from the search activities not only weakened the wandering off or accident hypotheses, but indirectly increased the weight of more serious scenarios, though without specific evidence to confirm them. Each area eliminated from the search list further narrowed the range of what might have happened, while clarifying that if external intervention occurred, it had been swift and discreet enough to leave no easily detectable traces. As time pressure continued to mount and resources became stretched, the large-scale search phase began revealing its inevitable limits, where effort and scale no longer correlated with the ability to find answers. It was in this impasse that the widespread search became a significant milestone in the case, not for what it discovered, but for what it did not find, forcing the entire process to confront the reality that Matthew had vanished in a way that exceeded ordinary scenarios, and that time, the one thing that could not be mobilized or extended, was gradually becoming the greatest adversary for both the family and the investigative system. The growing impasse after large-scale searches yielded no results forced the case handling process to shift to a different level of response, where the goal was no longer solely controlling geographical space, but maximizing information recognition through public alert systems. And in that context, the decision to activate the Amber Alert was made as a necessary escalation. Activating the Amber Alert meant Matthew's disappearance was no longer treated as an internal neighborhood or local issue, but became an emergency alert broadcast widely to the entire regional community, based on the assumption that if Matthew had left the initial search area, there was a high chance someone outside had seen or interacted with him. The Amber Alert mechanism immediately pushed basic information about Matthew into public channels, from highway electronic signs to mass media outlets, creating an unprecedented wave of attention since the case began. This shift marked the transition from specialized investigation and search to a large-scale effort to mobilize societal awareness. The media quickly joined the process, not just reporting but becoming part of the clue-gathering system, as Matthew's image and details were repeatedly shown on news broadcasts, social media, and online platforms, taking the case beyond the familiar community to reach a far broader public. Media involvement created a double-edged effect, on one hand increasing the chance someone would recognize Matthew or recall a seemingly insignificant detail, on the other pushing the case into a chaotic information space, where the line between useful clues and baseless speculation blurred. In a short time, a massive volume of tips poured in from the public: phone calls, emails, social media messages, each carrying hope it might be the missing key to locating Matthew. However, most were subjective, based on superficial similarities, vague memories, or guesses formed under strong media influence. For investigators, handling this flood of tips was both opportunity and challenge, as among hundreds there might be only a few truly relevant, but missing them amid a sea of noise was a real risk. Tip screening quickly became an enormous task, requiring established reliability criteria, categorizing information by source, timing, and fit with known case details to avoid being led down false paths. Many tips were checked and dismissed almost immediately for failing to match time, location, or identifying features, while others required deeper verification, consuming additional resources and time with no ultimate confirmation. This screening ran continuously alongside other investigative activities, gradually overloading the information processing system as data volume grew faster than real-world verification capacity. Pressure came not only from workload, but from public and family expectations, who saw the Amber Alert as proof the case was top priority, and hoped for a matching breakthrough. Each dismissed tip brought disappointment, while each new one sparked fragile hope. In that dense information environment, the greatest risk to the investigation was not lack of data, but being drowned in it, where critical details could be obscured by countless irrelevancies. Investigators had to adapt, shifting from direct searching to large-scale information management and analysis, a task not central in the case's early hours. The information overload also raised questions about the Amber Alert's true effectiveness in this specific context, as while it succeeded in raising community awareness, it did not guarantee that those with relevant information would come forward, or that provided tips would be accurate enough to yield results. As days passed without a strong enough tip to locate Matthew, the contrast between the alert scale and actual outcomes grew stark, exposing the limits of relying on public attention as an investigative tool. Internally among case handlers, maintaining the Amber Alert while screening tips became a difficult balancing act, as prolonging it too long could reduce effectiveness and system sensitivity, while ending it too soon risked missing critical information. The tip flow continued, but increasingly many were repetitive, contradictory, or baseless, making verification burdensome and slowing overall investigative pace. In that context, the Amber Alert became more than a search tool. It became a test of the system's ability to handle massive information volume under time pressure and high societal expectations. By the end of this phase, despite mobilizing widespread attention and collecting an unprecedented amount of information, Matthew's case remained no closer to a clear resolution, leaving the sense that the more people knew about the disappearance, the more inexplicable the boy's absence became, and that amid the noisy sea of tips, the real answer, if it existed, remained hidden beyond everyone's reach. The dense flow of information from the public alert system did not yield any verifiable leads, forcing the focus of the investigation to shift back to people, where possibilities of direct intervention were examined more closely through a review of the initial suspects who had spatial or behavioral connections to the area where Matthew disappeared. The suspect list was compiled from various sources, including individuals who had been seen near the residential area on the day of the incident, people with a history involving children, those exhibiting unusual behavior as reported by the community, and even indirect social connections who had interacted with the Harris family in the recent period. Each person on the list was placed in a separate evaluation framework based on level of access, mobility capability, potential motive, and consistency in statements. This review process required extreme caution, as expanding the scope of suspicion carried the risk of eroding community trust without clear grounds, while narrowing it too soon could overlook critical individuals. Therefore, investigators adopted a step-by-step approach, gradually eliminating unsuitable cases based on objective data rather than initial impressions. Interviewing related individuals became the central activity of this peak phase, aimed at gathering more detailed information about what had occurred in and around the Harris family's living area before and on the day Matthew went missing. Interviews were conducted in multiple rounds, focusing on clarifying schedules, behaviors, and seemingly minor interactions that could prove decisive when placed in the right context. During this process, fatigue and stress began to affect the quality of information, as witnesses' memories were no longer as sharp as in the initial hours, and recalled details tended to be reconstructed based on what they had heard or read in the media. This made distinguishing between original memory and inference more difficult, forcing investigators to continually cross-reference statements with objective data to avoid being led astray by inaccurate information. Parallel to the interviews, camera footage was examined in an effort to find visual evidence that could confirm or refute the hypotheses that had been proposed. Private security cameras, traffic cameras, and public recording devices in an expanded radius were all reviewed frame by frame in the hope of detecting images of Matthew or a suspicious vehicle or individual related to the disappearance. However, the quality of camera data was uneven, with many devices having limited angles, low resolution, or insufficient storage duration, making footage retrieval patchy and lacking continuity. Most of the obtained videos provided no definitive value, as they either did not capture the necessary area or were not clear enough for accurate identification. When some blurry or incomplete images were subjected to analysis, they quickly led to conflicting speculations, with differing opinions on whether they depicted Matthew or a related individual, adding another layer of noise that needed careful handling. Conflicting witnesses became a prominent issue in this phase, as statements that seemed to support each other revealed significant discrepancies in timing, location, and behavioral details, making it increasingly difficult to reconstruct a consistent sequence of events. Some witnesses changed their accounts between interviews, not necessarily due to deliberate concealment, but because of psychological pressure, repeated media information, and an unconscious desire to contribute to solving the case. These contradictions forced investigators to spend additional time verifying every small detail, from cross-checking statements with phone data and personal schedules to re-examining previously established timelines, a resource-intensive process but necessary to avoid building hypotheses on shaky foundations. Despite the thorough review of initial suspects and the parallel pursuit of multiple investigative directions, no evidence was strong enough to directly link any individual to Matthew's disappearance, causing each pursued path to end in a dead end. This not only depleted resources but also gradually eroded the investigation team's confidence in achieving a breakthrough within traditional methods. The absence of clear results in the peak phase created an uncomfortable paradox. The more data collected, the more tangled the overall picture became, with many pieces not fitting together, making it increasingly difficult to formulate a central hypothesis. Pressure from the family and the public continued to mount as expectations for a turning point, following the Amber Alert and large-scale searches went unmet, pushing the investigative force into a position where they had to maintain efforts, while confronting the reality that available tools were reaching their limits. Internally, reassessments of investigative progress began occurring more frequently, focusing on determining whether any direction had been overlooked, or whether the case required a completely different approach from what had been applied. However, every analysis returned to the same provisional conclusion that no significant breakthrough was waiting ahead if they continued pursuing current methods. By the end of this phase, the peak of the investigation was marked not by a decisive discovery, but by a collective acknowledgement that despite maximizing resources, reviewing suspects, conducting mass interviews, and checking visual data, Matthew's case had not moved closer to resolution, laying the groundwork for an inevitable shift in handling the file, where hope for quick results gradually gave way to the realization that the case was entering a different phase, less noisy but equally uncertain. The acknowledgement that the peak phase had yielded no results forced the entire file to be placed on the table for a comprehensive evaluation, where every investigative step taken was systematically reviewed to determine what had been achieved, what was missing, and the insurmountable limits within the current resource framework. This evaluation process focused not only on specific outcomes, but also on how the investigation had been conducted, from hypothesis building, field searches, public mobilization, to suspect reviews and information processing. Each area was analyzed to identify any procedural errors, methodological blind spots, or unnecessary overlaps that might have reduced overall effectiveness. The evaluation results showed that most traditional investigative directions had been pursued to their reasonable limits, with major hypotheses tested to the deepest extent possible based on available data, while no new evidence strong enough emerged to justify maintaining the same level of priority and resources as before. From this assessment, the decision to change the file's status was made not as an abandonment, but as a strategic adjustment reflecting the reality that the case had moved beyond the rapid resolution capabilities of initial investigative measures. The administrative decision to shift the case to cold case status was reached after multiple rounds of deliberation, as it carried heavy psychological and social consequences, especially for the Harris family, who viewed this step as a sign that hope of finding Matthew in the near future was fading. However, from a systemic perspective, keeping a non-progressing case at high priority for an extended period would divert resources needed for other urgent cases. When the file's status was changed, a series of accompanying adjustments were implemented, starting with gradually reducing direct resources allocated to the case, including scaling down the dedicated investigative team, cutting back on regular field searches, and limiting acceptance of new tips, unless they met stricter criteria for reliability and verifiability. This change did not happen abruptly but in stages, to ensure all pending information was fully processed before active operations ceased, while maintaining a minimal structure for potential reactivation if valuable leads emerged in the future. The deprioritization affected not only personnel, but also the case's place in the overall justice system landscape, as it no longer remained on lists for frequent updates or high-frequency periodic reporting, shifting instead to passive monitoring, where any new developments had to surpass a certain threshold to be considered. The official investigation, in the sense of proactive and continuous activities, thus reached a stopping point, leaving behind a file dense with information but lacking the decisive piece that could connect everything together. This cessation did not mean the case was closed permanently, but rather an acknowledgement that with existing tools and data, no further reasonable steps could be taken without repeating previously failed efforts. Matthew's file was reorganized according to cold case standards, with documents systematized, clearly marking tested hypotheses, eliminated directions, and unresolved questions, to enable any future investigator to access it quickly, without starting from scratch. Classifying the case as a cold case also brought changes in how it existed in public consciousness. As media attention gradually waned, updates became rarer, and the case slipped from the spotlight, making way for news stories and other tragedies. This silence, though socially understandable, created an unfillable void for the Harris family, who continued living with Matthew's unresolved absence. Within the investigative force, the shift to cold case was viewed as a prolonged temporary state, where the case was preserved in the system with hope that technological advancements, changed circumstances, or new information might one day revive what had hit a dead end. Thus, even though proactive activities had stopped, the file remained in a ready state, as a reminder that the story was not over, merely suspended between what was known and what remained out of reach. When the case was officially placed in the cold case category, an invisible boundary was drawn between the hot investigation phase full of hope and pressure, and a longer, quieter phase, where time became the dominant factor, no longer measured in hours or days but in months and years, and where patience, previously rarely mentioned, now became the sole prerequisite for Matthew's case to potentially be brought back into the light once more. The void left by the case after being classified as a cold case existed not only in the investigative file or the Harris family's life, but also parallel formed another reality, where Matthew continued to grow up unaware that he was the center of a suspended story. Under a different identity, the boy entered a new living environment, completely detached from his original context and memories, where his name, documents, and basic personal information were rebuilt from scratch like a blank page. This new identity was not the result of a personal choice, but the only framework in which he was allowed to exist, and thus, it gradually became natural in the immature perception of a child learning to adapt to the surrounding world. Matthew's new living environment bore very different characteristics from where he was born, from living spaces to relationship structures, but that difference was not recognized as a loss, as at that age, old memories were not clear enough to form comparisons. Instead, the new environment quickly became the norm, where habits were formed, relationships built, and a sense of security attached to new familiar faces. His daily living conditions unfolded in a stable framework, with a repetitive rhythm sufficient to create a sense of normalcy, from going to school, eating, resting, to simple play activities suitable for his age. In that world, Matthew was not treated as a missing child or a victim, but as an ordinary individual with needs and limits like any other child, making his life, viewed from the outside, show no clear signs of a tragedy unfolding parallel elsewhere. This very normalcy became the key factor in severing the connection between Matthew and his past, as there were no reminders or strong enough signs to trigger doubts about his true identity, and any questions, if they arose, were quickly extinguished by the familiar routine and a child's natural dependence on current caregivers. Throughout that time, Matthew had no awareness that he was a missing child, let alone an understanding of what it meant to be searched for or to exist in investigative files, as those concepts lay beyond a child's cognitive capacity. While living fully in the present, for him the world consisted only of what was happening in front of him, with no room for questions about origins or gaps in biography that adults typically assume are important. This lack of awareness was not the result of deliberate concealment on his part, but a natural consequence of growing up in an environment where the past had been restructured or erased, leaving any initial memories, if lingering, as vague sensations unattached to a specific story. In that context, Matthew had no contact with any elements of the investigative system, from police, social workers, to administrative agencies, capable of detecting identity anomalies, as his life unfolded on the margins of those mechanisms, where his existence was accepted without deep cross-referencing against central data. This lack of contact not only maintained the separation between Matthew and his own case, but also highlighted a notable reality. A child could grow up in a modern society, without being detected as living under a different identity, if monitoring and verification mechanisms were not tight enough or not activated at the right time. Over the years, Matthew continued to develop physically and cognitively within the new identity framework, building social relationships based on the assigned name and history, while his true identity remained dormant in a little-noticed cold case file. These two life paths, one the boy's actual life, the other the stalled search by the system, existed parallel without touching, creating a profound paradox about how a person could be fully present in social life while completely absent from the legal story attached to them. This separation persisted not due to a single event, but a chain of continuing normal conditions, where each uneventful day further reinforced the stability of the new life, while blurring the possibility of reconnecting with the past. From an indirect perspective, Matthew's life in this phase did not resemble a journey of escape or concealment, but a quiet flow, where the new identity was lived so naturally that no one, including himself, had reason to doubt it. That very quietness became the most effective cover, requiring no complexity or calculation, only the steady continuation of ordinary days. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Matthew's cold case gradually slipped from focused attention, and the lack of connection between his current life and the investigative file became complete, as if the two realities belonged to parallel worlds with no intersection. This part of Matthew's life, viewed from the outside, showed no signs of pursuit, no shadow of the legal or investigative system, only a child growing up in a pre-established framework, unconsciously carrying an identity, not his own, while his true identity remained confined in a cold file, awaiting some condition, yet unnamed, that could break the prolonged separation. The artificial normality in Matthew's new life elsewhere existed in parallel with a completely opposite reality for the Harris family, where every passing day carried an unanswered question and forced them to construct their own way of surviving based on absence. The case had been classified as a cold case, but for the family, it was not an administrative status but a feeling of being abandoned midway, so they maintained independent searches as a natural reflex to combat the silence gradually enveloping everything. At first, they revisited every detail that had been mentioned, rechecked locations already searched, recontacted old phone numbers, and tried to reach any organization or community that could help keep information about Matthew circulating in public life. Independent searching no longer took the form of large-scale group searches or massive mobilization campaigns like in the early phase, but shifted to small yet repetitive tasks requiring patience and endurance, updating photos, asking friends to share, maintaining contact with those who had promised to keep an eye out, recording messages, calls, vague tips, even knowing most would lead nowhere. That very repetition became the family's way of affirming that Matthew had not been forgotten, even as the world around them began moving on to other stories. The harsh reality was that there was no new verified information, and that absence was not like a door slamming shut but like an endless hallway, where each search effort only took them a few steps forward before returning to the same spot. Any leads that did appear were usually fragmented, unverifiable or repetitive of what had already been examined, forcing the family to learn to distinguish between healthy hope and self-destructive clinging. The lack of new information also changed the family's daily rhythm in a way not immediately visible from the outside. Every routine activity was overlaid with a layer of vigilance, every phone ring triggered a reflex of anticipation, every casual question from others could become a small cut, and every family event carried the empty space of a seat that would never be filled. The decline in hope happened slowly, not in a specific moment, but accumulated over weeks, months, disappointments. When "I'll call back" never turned into calls, when promises to check for you gradually faded, and when media coverage of the case grew increasingly sparse. The family did not lose faith in one day, they lost it little by little, in a way that when looking back, even they struggled to pinpoint the boundary between still hoping and just trying to hold on to hope. Time began dividing the Harris family's life into two halves before the day Matthew disappeared, and after that day, and the latter half stretched in a way that distorted all normal milestones. Birthdays, holidays, new school years, new summers, all became markers to realize Matthew was growing up somewhere they didn't know, while imagination constantly had to fill in the missing parts. The family continued seeing Matthew in children of the same age, in laughter at playgrounds, in school uniforms, and gradually, those comparisons became more painful as the age gap widened. Matthew was no longer the 6-year-old boy from the day he went missing, but he had also never been witnessed by the family growing into 7, 8, 9. That developmental void made the boy's image both frozen and drifting, creating a particular kind of pain unique to long-term missing persons cases. Maintaining independent searches over time also confronted the family with very real limitations: costs, time, mental health, the fatigue of supporters, and even changes in the surrounding community. Neighbors moved away, social relationships faded, volunteers no longer showed up as before, and the family realized they could not rely forever on others' initial energy. Independent searching thus became a long-distance run, where the strategy was no longer to go big but to endure, keeping contact with reliable leads, archiving all information, maintaining a minimal presence of the case in accessible channels, and most importantly, not letting themselves be drowned by thousands of meaningless possibilities. The lack of new verified information also gave rise to an internal tension within the family, as each member coped with time differently. Some needed to talk about Matthew often to feel he was still close. Others avoided mentioning him because they couldn't bear being pulled back to the starting point. Those differences sometimes turned into conflicts, not from lack of love, but because each was trying to protect themselves in their own way. The decline in hope over time did not necessarily mean giving up, but it forced the family to adjust expectations to continue living. They still viewed Matthew as missing, still kept the possibility of finding him alive in their minds, but simultaneously had to learn to function with the reality that tomorrow might still bring no answer. This balance was fragile and easily broken, as just a rumor or a wrong call was enough to stretch all emotions back to the early days. The missing status for the family was not a word in a file but a prolonged living condition, where every choice was overshadowed by the question: what if Matthew returns from moving house, changing phone numbers, switching jobs, to keeping familiar objects? Many decisions became harder, because they carried the fear that any change could be the wrong one at the wrong time. Matthew remained officially listed as missing, and that very no conclusion nature made the pain endless, with no closing ritual, no moment to turn the page. The family was not allowed to be certain whether they were waiting for someone alive or grieving someone lost. They were only allowed to live between those two possibilities, and time was the only thing continuing forward. Nevertheless, the family's maintenance of independent searches, even in silence and without results, still held meaning as the last thread connecting them to Matthew, not because it always produced progress, but because it helped them resist absolute helplessness. Each small action, a follow-up call, an information update, a community reminder, was their way of affirming that Matthew's story had not been closed in their minds, even if the system had paused at an official level. Time in this phase did not heal simply, it reshaped, turning panic into exhaustion, expectation into caution, blazing hope into a small flame that had to be shielded daily to keep from going out, and turning, finding Matthew from a campaign into a living condition. In that flow, the Harris family continued to exist with Matthew as a present absence, a son still considered missing, and an unpredictable future, where the prolonged waiting was not because they wanted it that way, but because they had no other choice. The prolonged waiting state of the Harris family not only reflected personal pain, but also exposed a broader reality. where Matthew's disappearance was not maintained as an ongoing alert throughout the entire system, but gradually dissolved in a fragmented data network, built more to serve individual administrative purposes than to trace a vanished person. Data related to children at that time existed scattered across multiple systems, from birth records, medical, educational, social welfare, to law enforcement databases, each operating under its own standards, priorities, and scope of responsibility, making information about a child fully present in small pieces, but never assembled into a comprehensive picture. In Matthew's case, his identity was clearly recorded in the missing persons file, but the existence of a child with a different identity elsewhere did not automatically trigger any comparison or alert mechanism, because these systems were not designed to communicate with each other proactively. The lack of cross-referencing between systems meant that data which should have been placed side by side to raise questions continued to exist in parallel without intersecting. For example, a new child record registered in another area was not automatically compared to state or federal missing children lists unless a specific strong factor triggered that process. This lack of connectivity was not a single technical error, but a consequence of how the systems were built in independent functional blocks, where data sharing was restricted by legal barriers, privacy concerns, differences in storage standards, and policy priorities that did not place missing children at the top of routine processes. In that context, the absence of a proactive missing child detection mechanism became a serious loophole, as the system mostly reacted only to specific requests or directly reported unusual events, rather than continuously scanning and cross-checking for potential matches. This meant a child could pass through many important administrative milestones, from medical care, school enrollment, to support programs, without ever having their true identity questioned, as long as accompanying documents met the minimum standards of each individual system. This reactive rather than preventive operation made the concept of missing gradually become static, framed in a file that did not self-update over time, while the child's real life continued developing outside control. Systemic errors thus lay not in an individual or a specific decision, but in the very structure that allowed prolonged gaps without self-correction mechanisms, where responsibility was fragmented to the point that no one was accountable for the overall picture. For many years, Matthew being considered missing existed as a legal status detached from social reality, because no process required other systems to proactively query that status when accepting a new child into their records. Data fragmentation also reduced the ability to detect anomalies over time, as each system only saw a narrow slice of life, insufficient to recognize that the appearance of a new child here might match in age, characteristics, or circumstances with a child being sought elsewhere. Without cross-referencing, weak signals, crucial in long-term missing cases, were never amplified into notable suspicions, but overlooked as normal data in the administrative flow. The lack of detection mechanism also created a false sense of security for the system, where the absence of alerts was misinterpreted as no issues, while in reality, it reflected an untriggered loophole. In this context, systemic errors not only allowed a child to live under a different identity undetected, but also left the Harris family with no signals to believe the system was still monitoring their case proactively. That prolonged silence was not the result of individual indifference, but a consequence of a structure prioritizing high-volume administrative data processing over complex interagency exceptions. Over time, these loopholes became invisible to system operators, as they caused no immediate errors, did not disrupt daily processes, and did not generate enough political or media pressure to force reform. For the Harris family, Matthew still being considered missing while another child with a new identity existed legally elsewhere was a paradox only possible in a system where data was not designed to seek truth, but only to confirm surface validity. The very absence of a continuous aggregation and cross-referencing mechanism turned time into an ally of discrepancy, as each passing year without new alerts reinforced the assumption that nothing needed re-examination. Systemic loopholes thus not only prolonged Matthew's case, but also created dangerous precedent for similar cases, where a child could disappear from one community without ever truly disappearing from society, simply slipping through the gaps of disjointedly designed systems. Throughout this period, the parallel existence of a frozen missing persons file and an ongoing normal life was not the result of a sophisticated conspiracy, but a product of accumulated errors, where each system did its part correctly, but no one was responsible for the bigger question, whether there was a child living among us who shouldn't be there under their current identity. That very question, never systematically asked for many years, allowed the gap to continue widening, letting Matthew's case linger in limbo between data and life, between what was recorded and what was actually happening, and between a system running smoothly on paper and a human reality overlooked at its edges. The silently operating systemic loopholes continued to enable another reality to form, where the emergence of a new child record did not create any significant ripple large enough to touch Matthew's cold case, even though logically, the two data points should have been placed side by side. This new record was established through normal administrative procedures, documenting the existence of a child with a separate identity, personal information, and family background, sufficient to meet the minimum requirements of the receiving system. In the massive daily data flow that agencies had to process, the appearance of such a record was not unusual, did not trigger automatic alerts, and was not seen as a case needing deeper scrutiny. The information in the record, when viewed individually, did not fully match what was recorded about Matthew in the missing persons file: different name, different background, valid documents by current standards, and a personal story consistent enough not to raise immediate suspicion. That very lack of absolute match became the key factor preventing the two records from ever being placed in the same analytical frame. In systems operating on exact match criteria, surface differences were often enough to rule out relevance, especially without mechanisms designed to detect indirect similarities, like corresponding age, timing of appearance, or unusual gaps in prior history. The information not fully matching meant this new child record existed as an independent entity, not linked to any open investigations or cold cases, because no process required investigators or administrative staff to proactively cross-check such cases against missing children lists periodically. In that context, the parallel existence of two records, one of Matthew frozen in cold case status, one of the other child continuing to be updated over time, was not seen as contradictory, but simply as two non-intersecting data streams. Periodic reviews, if any, mainly focused on checking internal completeness and validity of each record, rather than seeking potential connections across different systems, allowing the new child record to continue slipping through every control layer without leaving notable traces. In actual operation, a record being overlooked was not the result of individual negligence, but a consequence of how the system was designed to handle large data volumes under narrow criteria, prioritizing administrative efficiency over detecting complex exceptions. Without specific investigative requests, the new child record was only examined within the scope of the receiving agency's function, from ensuring access to medical services, education, to other related procedures, with no reason to question the deeper origin of the provided identity. The absence of an automatic linkage mechanism to cold cases made this overlooking entirely logical within the system's internal logic, even though from the outside, it was a serious failure in protecting missing children. Over time, the new child record continued to be updated with normal developmental milestones, each update further reinforcing the sense that this was a valid case, further reducing the chance anyone would revisit minor initial inconsistencies that might have existed. Meanwhile, Matthew's record remained dormant in the cold case category, not cross-referenced with newly arising data, because the system had no internal incentive to perform that comparison, unless an external specific lead emerged. The two records, not being linked, not only reflected data fragmentation, but also showed how match criteria were interpreted too narrowly, where only perfect overlaps were deemed noteworthy, while structural similarities in timing and age were ignored. The overlooking during review processes thus did not appear as a clear mistake, but as a series of reasonable decisions within each separate system context, but when accumulated, they created a gap large enough for the truth to remain hidden for a long time. Notably, there was no specific moment when the new child record almost got linked to Matthew's case and then was missed, because in the current operational logic, that linkage possibility was never seriously considered. The absence of the most important question, whether this child could be someone else, made the entire process run smoothly to the point no one noticed the anomaly. Over the years, the existence of the new child record and the freezing of Matthew's record continued in parallel without intersection, creating a profound paradox about how a system could manage one child's life, while failing to recognize that child might be the subject of a long-term search. The very lack of complete information match, something that should have prompted caution, instead became the most effective shield hiding the connection, as it allowed all parties to believe there was no reason to dig deeper. The record being overlooked in reviews was not a single moment, but a prolonged state, where each check cycle further reinforced the assumption that everything was fine, and no overlap needed handling. In that context, the truth about Matthew was not concealed by a sophisticated conspiracy or complex deception, but by the system's prioritization of surface consistency over the ability to question what lay outside the norm, and that prioritization allowed a different child record to exist normally, while Matthew's record continued to lie dormant as a question no one proactively answered. The parallel existence of two non-intersecting files caused the following years to pass in a state of near stasis for the official process, where no significant investigative progress was recorded, and any remaining activity was limited to minimal maintenance. Once the case had been classified as a cold case, the periodic update procedures produced no change, as there were no new leads meeting the activation threshold, no emerging evidence strong enough to force the system to revisit old hypotheses, and no sufficient external pressure to alter priorities. Any reports that were prepared were mostly summaries of what was already known, repeating prior interim conclusions and confirming that the case status remained unchanged. During this time, the lack of progress did not occur noisily, but quietly, with each passing month leaving no memorable milestone for the investigation, causing the case to gradually be pushed to the margins of organizational awareness, where newer, more urgent cases continually emerged and claimed resources and attention. The case thus gradually faded from public consciousness, not because it was less serious, but because time dulled the sense of urgency. The media no longer mentioned it, the community no longer discussed it, and Matthew's name rarely appeared in news reports, turning the boy's disappearance from a story, followed by the entire region, into a faint memory for most of those who had once cared. This forgetting did not happen evenly, because for the Harris family, time did not bring relief corresponding to society's silence. On the contrary, it prolonged and deepened their state of mental strain, as each passing day reminded them that Matthew had still not been found, and that the distance between the present and the day of the disappearance was growing ever larger. The family had to confront a particular form of exhaustion, not from a single shock but from prolonged erosion, where hope was neither strong enough to sustain the spirit, nor weak enough to allow letting go. They continued to live with an unanswered question, while the energy to search, to hope and to face consolations grew increasingly limited. In this phase, The family's independent search efforts, if any remained, also narrowed in scale and intensity, not because they stopped caring, but because the repetition of disappointment forced them to protect themselves from further erosion. Keeping daily life functioning became a necessary priority for survival, even if that meant being unable to devote all their time and mind to searching for Matthew as before. The mental depletion affected not only individuals in the family, but also the relationships between them, as each person had their own way of coping with time and uncertainty, leading to differences in how pain and hope were expressed. Those differences sometimes created distance, not from lack of love, but because no one had enough energy to continually return to the starting point of the loss. Meanwhile, for the investigative system, the period 2020-2022 was marked by a false stability, where there was neither progress nor new failures, only repeated confirmation that everything remained at a standstill. Matthew's file lay dormant in storage, preserved as a possibility for the future, rather than a current task, and accessed only for specific requests, which rarely occurred in the absence of new leads. The prolongation of time also changed how the case was perceived from a societal perspective, as it was no longer seen as an ongoing tragedy, but as an old case, a story without an ending, but no longer expected to be resolved soon. This shift in perception made rekindling attention more difficult, as each passing year increased the feeling that all possibilities had already been considered. In that space, Matthew remained unfound, not because no one was looking, but because the existing tools and structures did not create opportunities for the truth to surface. The boy existed as a prolonged absence, a name on the missing children list, with no new images, no updated information, and no sign that the gap between the present and the day of disappearance was narrowing. The prolonged time also transformed how the family imagined Matthew, as the image of the 6-year-old boy gradually no longer matched the reality that if alive, he would have grown much older. This discrepancy created a void in their imagination, where the family tried to hold on to the familiar image, while being forced to acknowledge that they did not know what Matthew looked like now, how he spoke, or what conditions he was living in. This further heightened the sense of helplessness, as the inability to update the mental image of their loved one made the loss more abstract and harder to grasp. Throughout this phase, there were no explosive moments or unexpected turning points, only the steady continuation of days without answers, causing the case to gradually be covered in a layer of dust that no one actively brushed away. The Harris family, though mentally depleted, continued to exist in a state of waiting, because completely giving up would mean accepting a conclusion they were not ready to face. That waiting no longer carried the appearance of bright hope, but became part of daily life, a background condition around which all other decisions revolved. While society continued to move forward, with new events, new stories, and new concerns, Matthew remained unfound, and it was this very prolongation that defined the 2020-2022 period, as a heavy silence in the entire story, where there was no investigative progress, no widespread attention, only the family continuing to gradually deplete under the weight of time, and an unsolved disappearance. The prolonged silence of the years without progress did not mean that all efforts had completely ceased, because while Matthew's case existed as a cold case frozen on the surface, beneath it there were still small, scattered, and little-noticed movements, where certain individuals in the system began to re-examine what had been overlooked in a more cautious and discreet manner. The review of administrative data did not occur as an official campaign, but arose from the need to recheck old files in the context of new data analysis tools gradually becoming available, and the digitization of information being advanced more than at the initial time of the case. Data sets that had been scattered across multiple systems began to be more easily accessible, allowing examination of information patterns in depth, rather than just on a case-by-case basis. In this process, attention was directed toward child records created in the time period corresponding to Matthew's disappearance, not to seek perfect matches, but to identify small anomalies in timing, age, or context of appearance that had not previously been taken seriously. This quiet review of administrative data did not produce immediate results, as most records, when viewed individually, were valid by system standards, but placing them side by side along timelines and geography gradually revealed noteworthy gaps. In parallel, school and medical records were brought into the scope of review, not due to specific suspicion, but because these were the most important points of contact for a child with the social system, where identity is used repeatedly over years and has the potential to reveal discrepancies if they exist. Enrollment records, school transfers, vaccinations, and medical visits were examined with a different eye than before, focusing on detecting cases lacking original data, unclear prior history, or sudden appearance without an accompanying continuous chain of information. Among the many records reviewed, most yielded nothing beyond confirmation that they followed normal procedures, but the persistence in working through that large volume of data created conditions for a few cases to begin standing out as slight deviations from the general background. These anomalies were not clear enough to immediately trigger a formal investigation, but they lingered in the awareness of those conducting the review, as they could not be easily explained by ordinary administrative reasons. The late detection of anomalies did not occur as an explosive moment, but as an accumulating sensation, where a specific record, when considered in relation to other data, began to raise questions that had never been asked before. Those questions revolved around the appearance of a child with an incomplete prior history, the timing of record creation coinciding with the period of another disappearance classified as a cold case, and the fact that related data had not been cross-referenced over many years. Identifying such anomalies required patience and a healthy level of skepticism, as any hasty conclusion could lead to pursuing a wrong direction, especially when the initial data was not strong enough to stand alone as evidence. For this reason, the new suspicions formed in this phase were kept internal, not widely announced, and not changing the official status of the case, to avoid creating expectations or pressure without solid grounds. The formation of new suspicions was not based on a single detail, but on the intersection of many small factors, from gaps in administrative records, slight inconsistencies in school data, to the lack of clear connection between a child and its past before a certain point. These factors, when placed in the broader context of Matthew's case, began to create a possibility that had not previously been fully considered. Notably, this quiet investigative process did not occur under the time pressure of the early phase, allowing participants space for long-term thinking and structural questions rather than event reactions. Paradoxically, this slowness opened the possibility of seeing connections that prior urgency had obscured. The review of school and medical records also revealed the reality that these systems often prioritize ensuring continuous service to the individual over deeply verifying the origin of identity. As long as current documents meet minimum requirements, this made initial anomalies easy to overlook, but when revisited with a different purpose, they began to take on new meaning. In that context, new suspicions did not emerge as accusations or conclusions, but as cautious hypotheses, needing verification through methods beyond the traditional investigative tools that had previously failed. The existence of these suspicions also raised questions about the role of time in resolving cold cases, as the many years of distance had allowed data to accumulate enough to form patterns that could not previously be identified. The quiet investigation thus became an important transitional phase, where Matthew's case, though still in the cold case category, began to escape complete stasis, not through loud actions or official announcements, but through subtle changes in how data was viewed and questioned. As new suspicions gradually formed, they were not yet enough to alter the file's fate, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in the prolonged silence, signaling that the story might not be over as it had been left undisturbed for many years, and that somewhere in that seemingly lifeless mass of data, the truth about Matthew might be waiting to be connected in a completely different way from what had been tried before. The new suspicions formed from the quiet review process were not strong enough to stand on their own if relying solely on traditional record comparison, and that very limitation forced investigative thinking to shift to a different approach, where biological data began to be seen as a viable key to connecting the information fragments that had been scattered for many years. Next-generation DNA technology, particularly DNA genealogy, emerged in this context not as an immediate solution, but as a tool capable of overcoming barriers that old methods could not resolve, because it does not depend entirely on direct matches between identity and records, but exploits genetic relationships to trace back human origins. Unlike traditional DNA techniques that require direct comparison samples from identified suspects or victims, DNA genealogy allows expanding the search scope beyond known subjects by comparing genetic data against genealogical databases built from millions of individuals who voluntarily shared their information. This capability made the technology particularly suitable for long-standing cold cases, where the true identity of related subjects may have been concealed or completely changed, as in Matthew's case. The consideration of applying DNA genealogy did not occur in blind optimism, but with cautious assessments of feasibility, legality, and ethics, as the use of genetic data always raises questions about privacy and the limits of investigative intervention. However, the prolonged deadlock and the existence of new suspicions made this option gradually more reasonable than continuing passive waiting. The applicability of this technology to Matthew's case depended on many factors, including access to suitable DNA samples, the ability to match data in open genealogical databases, and the level of cooperation between specialized units. But most importantly, it opened a completely different approach, no longer based on the assumption that an individual's current identity is immutable. This shift in investigative approach was strategic, as it moved the focus from trying to prove a specific hypothesis to letting biological data lead the way, allowing genetic relationships to reveal connections that administrative records could never show. In that context, DNA genealogy was not seen as a tool to find the perpetrator in the traditional sense, but as a means to re-identify, clarify origins, and reframe fundamental questions about the person under investigation. Preparing for the data matching process required a complex series of steps, from collecting and preserving DNA samples to strict standards, to selecting suitable genealogical databases, and determining the initial comparison scope. Each step needed to be carried out carefully to ensure accuracy and usability of results in subsequent stages. Unlike previous investigative methods that relied heavily on speed and quick response, this process demanded patience and absolute precision, as even a small error in data handling could lead to irreparable wrong conclusions. Preparation for matching was not just a technical issue but also a mindset adjustment, as investigators had to accept that results, if any, might not appear as clear answers, but as distant relationships needing analysis and inference through multiple intermediate layers. DNA genealogy thus did not promise an immediate explosive moment, but opened a complex tracing process, where each piece of genetic data was placed in the context of family, lineage, and personal history to gradually narrow the search scope. The biggest difference of this approach from prior efforts lay in the fact that it did not depend on someone remembering, reporting, or leaving traces but on a factor almost unchanging over time: DNA. In a case where time had become the greatest enemy, using a tool not eroded by time held special significance. However, applying DNA genealogy also brought limitations and risks, as results could be too broad, generating numerous potential relationships needing gradual elimination, or conversely, insufficient data to create any notable connections. Therefore, preparation always involved clearly defining evaluation criteria and subsequent verification steps if promising results appeared. In the context of Matthew's case, the shift to DNA genealogy was not widely announced, but implemented in a narrow scope, as a controlled experimental effort to avoid creating premature expectations from the family and public. This quietness reflected lessons learned from previous phases, where each time hope was raised high without results left heavy psychological consequences. Instead, the new technology was seen as a door just cracked open, enough to let light in but not wide enough to claim the answer was right behind it. Preparation for data matching thus proceeded in a state of both expectation and caution, where each advance was double-checked, and each possibility weighed against the entire history of prior failures in the case. It was in this caution that DNA genealogy began to reshape the entire story, not by delivering immediate conclusions, but by changing the core question from where did Matthew go, to who is Matthew really in the current context. A seemingly small shift, but powerful enough to shake the foundation of the entire investigative process that had been stalled for many years. The meticulous preparatory steps of the genetic genealogy investigation finally led to the moment when the first match results were presented for analysis, not as a complete solution, but as a series of biological signals clear enough to alter the entire status of the case. The initial results revealed notable genetic overlaps between the DNA sample used in the screening process and the data of several individuals in public genealogy databases, individuals who had no direct connection whatsoever to Matthew's past missing person record. This degree of matching could not be interpreted as identity confirmation, but it far exceeded random thresholds, sufficient to affirm the existence of a traceable blood relationship, creating a scientific foundation that previous investigative methods had never achieved. The discovery of these match levels marked a significant shift, as for the first time in many years, the case no longer relied entirely on witness memories, behavioral inferences, or unverifiable hypotheses, but was anchored in objective biological data. However, this very characteristic also made the evaluation process more complex, because genetic genealogy does not provide direct answers, but only opens branches of possibilities that require in-depth analysis. Assessing the reliability of the match results became the central task, where each genetic connection was subjected to rigorous statistical scrutiny, including kinship probability, data coverage in the genealogy database, and the possibility of indirect relationships unrelated to the case. Experts had to clearly distinguish between matches that were merely directional and those strong enough to infer identity, as confusing the two concepts could lead to seriously erroneous conclusions. Each result was examined in the context of family migration histories, extended family structures, and demographic factors that could distort data interpretation. This process did not happen quickly, as it required combining genetic knowledge with investigative reasoning, where numbers had to be placed into specific human stories. Although the genetic signals generated a new level of confidence that Matthew might be living under a different identity, they were still insufficient to form a legal basis for any official action, as the justice system requires direct, independently verifiable evidence tied to a specific individual. Genetic genealogy, by its nature, serves only as a guiding tool, helping narrow the search scope and form suspicions, but cannot independently meet courtroom evidence standards. This lack of legal grounds forced investigators to maintain a difficult balance between hope and professional discipline, as they understood that any hasty action based on incomplete results could severely damage the validity of the entire process. Instead of announcements or coercive measures, the decision was made to continue verification discreetly, treating the DNA match results as a preliminary map needing detailed clarification. The subsequent verification process focused on tracing back the suggested blood relationships, building extended family trees to identify individuals most likely matching Matthew's age, gender, and case-related timelines. Each analyzed family branch underwent careful elimination to determine whether any reasonable alternative scenario could explain the genetic match without involving Matthew. In parallel, the DNA results were cross-referenced with previously screened administrative and social records, seeking intersections that previously lacked grounds for attention, but now, under the light of genetic data, began to take on different meaning. Continued verification not only required time but also demanded close coordination across multiple specialties, from genetics and data analysis to traditional investigative work, to ensure that every new assumption was validated from various angles. Psychological pressure during this phase was high, not due to a lack of leads as before, but because of the presence of too many possibilities, each potentially a key or a new dead end. Investigators constantly reminded themselves that DNA results, though promising, were only part of the picture, and premature assignment could lead to irreparable mistakes. This caution was reinforced by the case's history of failures, where hopes had been raised and dashed multiple times, leaving heavy psychological consequences for the Harris family. Therefore, every verification step was conducted in silence, with limited access and strict confidentiality protocols, to avoid creating new waves of expectation before solid grounds existed. While not yet meeting legal conditions for action, the DNA match results still held enormous strategic value, as they reshaped the entire case approach, shifting from blind searching to a structured process where each step was based on measurable data. Continued verification was thus not seen as delay, but as a necessary phase to transform scientific data into usable investigative knowledge. The initial results also forced the system to reconsider long-held assumptions about Matthew's possible survival, as genetic data reflects biological existence rather than disappearance, opening a possibility previously maintained only as fragile belief. In that context, DNA match results were not a conclusion but a new foothold, solid enough for the case to move forward after years of stagnation. The absence of clear legal grounds did not diminish the significance of what had been achieved, but instead emphasized the importance of proceeding step by step, as this might be the only opportunity to move Matthew's case out of cold case status without repeating past mistakes. As the verification process continued, the DNA match results had fulfilled their most important role, breaking the prolonged silence of time and proving that however late, science could still open a path to the truth if used with sufficient patience, discipline, and respect for necessary legal boundaries. The DNA match results after prolonged verification created a foundation solid enough for Matthew's case to be removed for the first time from passive waiting status, as the necessary conditions to reactivate the official process gradually converged. The decision to reopen the file was not made as an immediate reaction but as the outcome of multiple internal evaluation rounds, where genetic data, administrative records, and accumulated suspicions over the years were placed side by side to determine that the case had entered a completely different phase compared to when it was classified as a cold case. When the file was reopened, the cold case unit officially took central control, bringing experience in handling long-standing cases and the ability to coordinate resources in a more focused manner than during the initial investigation phase. This handover was not merely organizational, but also reflected a shift in investigative philosophy, from searching for scattered clues to building a strategy based on systematically accumulated and analyzed data. From the outset, the cold case unit determined that reopening the case required close interagency coordination, as the genetic genealogy approach could not be effective if limited to one unit. Geneticists, data analysts, legal experts, and traditional investigators were integrated into a single working structure to ensure every decision was considered from multiple perspectives. This coordination also aimed to address gaps that existed in prior phases, where data was fragmented and not cross-referenced, by establishing clear information exchange channels and controlled data sharing mechanisms across different systems. In that context, the DNA-focused investigation was established as the main axis of the entire process, not as a supplementary tool, but as the foundation guiding all subsequent activities. Genetic data was no longer viewed merely as potential leads, but became the criterion directing resource prioritization, target selection for verification, and hypothesis building. Reopening the file allowed investigators to revisit records previously overlooked or deemed irrelevant, this time under the light of DNA results, thereby reassessing their value in the overall picture. Defining investigative objectives became a key step in this phase, as after years of deadlock, overexpansion could repeat old mistakes. Instead, the cold case unit focused on narrowing the scope based on identified genetic connections, combined with temporal, geographic, and administrative factors to form a clear priority list. Investigative objectives were no longer indefinite searching but verifying the identity of one individual or a very small group of individuals with the highest likelihood of matching available data, while clarifying the chain of events that led to Matthew living under a different identity for many years. Reopening the file also entailed re-evaluating related legal standards to ensure every subsequent step could stand firm if the case advanced to more formal procedures. Legal advisors were brought in early to define boundaries between directed investigation and coercive action, avoiding risks that had halted previous investigative directions. Interagency coordination in this phase was not only technical, but also created an internal control mechanism, where each hypothesis had to be challenged from multiple sides before being accepted as a viable direction. The DNA-focused investigation also required continuous updating and refining of assumptions, as each new verification result could alter the initial priority structure. The cold case unit thus maintained a flexible process, allowing strategy adjustments without losing overall objective consistency. Clearly defined investigative objectives helped avoid resource dispersion, while creating a specific roadmap to transition from scientific data to verifiable investigative action. In the context of reopening the file, Matthew's case no longer existed as a forgotten cold case, but became a focused investigative project, where every step was weighed based on past lessons and the potential of modern technology. This reactivation carried no fanfare or widespread announcement, as all involved parties clearly recognized that success in this phase depended on keeping the process under control, avoiding public pressure that could distort professional decisions. As the cold case unit took over, interagency coordination was established, and investigative objectives were defined based on the DNA direction. The case entered a new phase, where for the first time in many years, the pieces no longer existed in parallel but began to be arranged in an order capable of leading to answers. Reopening the file with a focus on DNA pushed the entire investigative process to a critical boundary, where every hypothesis, no matter how carefully constructed, held no value if not transformed into direct biological evidence. After multiple rounds of indirect verification, direct DNA testing became an unavoidable step, as it was the only way to turn probabilistic connections into an indisputable conclusion. The decision to conduct this testing was placed within a stricter legal framework than any previous phase, as all involved parties clearly recognized that the obtained results would not only affect the investigative direction, but also reshape the entire legal and humanitarian narrative of the case. Biological samples were collected through a closed process, with independent oversight and full traceability, to ensure no questions arose regarding origin, integrity, or potential tampering. Direct DNA testing did not occur as a single procedure, but as a series of purposefully repeated steps, where different laboratories conducted parallel analysis to eliminate errors and ensure result consistency. In this process, new genetic data was compared against biological records stored from the Harris family in the early years of the case, including original DNA samples preserved for long-term comparison purposes, creating a biological link across time that traditional investigative methods could not achieve. Comparing biological records went beyond confirming parent-child relationships to include checking rare genetic markers, characteristic gene variants, and highly heritable factors, completely ruling out random matches or technical errors. As independent results from multiple sources began to converge, the match level surpassed all ordinary statistical thresholds, shifting from high probability to near absolute affirmation, rendering alternative assumptions unreasonable. This moment did not unfold as a dramatic announcement, but as a heavy silence in the professional space, as those directly involved understood they were facing a truth far weightier than a mere investigative achievement. Confirming Matthew Harris's identity was not simply matching a name to a genome but closing a years-long ambiguous state, where a person existed outside all official classifications, present in social life yet absent from the legal system. In this context, confirming the victim's identity carried a completely reversed meaning compared to most criminal cases, as instead of confirming death or the identity of a deceased person, the system had to confront the reality that a child presumed missing had grown up and continuously existed beyond the observation of mechanisms designed to protect him. The investigative climax thus came not from coercive action or a confession, but from the slow yet irreversible convergence of science, data, and time, where every scattered piece finally locked together with indisputable biological evidence. However, due to the special importance of this conclusion, the entire confirmation process was repeated multiple times under different conditions, with participation from independent laboratories and experts not directly involved in the case, to ensure no errors could later undermine the conclusion. Scientific reports were cross-reviewed, analysis methods compared, and all underlying assumptions debated, as an erroneous conclusion at this stage would not only destroy the case, but cause irreparable harm to those involved. When all verification layers yielded the same result, Matthew Harris's identity was confirmed at the highest level permitted by science and law, ending the missing status biologically, and putting a period to one of the case's biggest questions. The investigative climax at this point did not erupt into emotion, as the system required absolute control, but beneath the professional surface lay a profound shift. The case was no longer a journey to find a vanished child, but became a journey confronting the years stolen from him. Identity confirmation also triggered a series of structural consequences, from updating Matthew's legal status and adjusting administrative records, to preparing for sensitive decisions regarding his rights, safety, and future in the context of his true identity being revealed. For the cold case unit, this was the technical pinnacle of the investigation, where every hypothesis was transformed into provable truth, yet simultaneously the moment forcing them to pause and recognize that this professional success opened a far more complex human phase. Confirming Matthew Harris's identity did not close the story, but completely changed its nature, from a long-standing missing person case to a reality where life, identity, and time intersected in ways no one had predicted. The investigative climax thus did not end with a sense of complete fulfillment, but with the realization that biologically finding Matthew was only the first step in confronting the long-lasting consequences of his absence. When the identity was confirmed indisputably, the case transcended the boundary of a resolved cold case to enter a new space, where the central question was no longer who or where but what happens next for a child separated from his original life for many years, and now facing that truth in a world that had completely changed. The confirmation of Matthew Harris's identity through biological evidence did not immediately lead to a face-to-face meeting, because the entire process at this point had to shift from the logic of investigation to the logic of human protection, where every step of approach carried the risk of causing harm if not tightly controlled. The initial contact with Matthew was designed as a strictly supervised process involving psychologists, social workers, and legal representatives to ensure that the approach did not create sudden shock or a sense of violation for an individual who had lived fully for many years under a different identity. The goal of this phase was not to reconfirm the identity, which had already been scientifically proven, but to assess Matthew's current psychological state, understand how he perceived himself, his living environment, and the relationships around him, and thereby determine his level of readiness to receive information that could upend the entire foundation of his life. The experts approached Matthew in a neutral role, unconnected to the investigation or the missing person past, to avoid triggering suspicion or defensiveness, while observing how he responded to general questions about his life, early memories, and sense of belonging. In this process, the lack of immediate recognition became a key factor, as Matthew showed no signs of awareness that he knew or suspected his true identity. All his responses were consistent with someone who believed his current life was self-evident, with no gaps needing explanation. This lack of recognition was not seen as an obstacle, but as critical data that helped the experts understand that revealing the truth required careful preparation to avoid causing a severe identity crisis. The psychological assessment of Matthew revealed an individual highly adapted to his current environment, with stable social connections and no clear signs of trauma related to disrupted memories, a positive signal of resilience, yet also a major challenge for the reunification process, as any abrupt intervention could shatter that fragile balance. In that context, supervised contact aimed not only to protect Matthew, but also to preserve the integrity of the future reunification process, preventing a moment that should be healing from becoming a long-term traumatic experience. The initial contact sessions were structured along a gradual pathway, where information was shared indirectly, focusing on feelings of safety, trust, and the ability to handle change, rather than diving straight into the core issues of identity or biological family. The psychological evaluation in this phase was not intended to diagnose or label, but to identify protective factors and risks, thereby developing an approach plan suited to Matthew's own pace, rather than imposing expectations from the system or the biological family. The lack of immediate recognition also reflected an important reality. For Matthew, the concept of being missing did not exist in his personal experience, and therefore being found did not carry the meaning of liberation that society or the media typically imagine. This forced the participants to adjust their perspective, recognizing that reunification was not a single event, but a complex psychological process that needed careful preparation from both sides. During the initial contact phase, the experts also began preparing for the possibility of reunification by assessing Matthew's potential reactions to information about his biological family, not to predict specific emotions, but to determine the level of support needed when the truth was revealed. This preparation included developing different approach scenarios, from introducing the concept of a biological family in an abstract way, to gradually connecting Matthew to his past story, always prioritizing psychological safety. Throughout the entire process, patience became the core principle, as any attempt to rush risked breaking the newly formed trust, not only between Matthew and the experts, but also between Matthew and his own life story. Initial contact therefore did not produce explosive moments or intense emotions as often expected in reunification stories, but unfolded quietly, slowly, and under control, reflecting respect for an individual who had lived many years unaware that he was the center of a long-running case. The preparation for reunification in this phase did not aim to guarantee a perfect outcome, but to minimize as much as possible the risk of secondary trauma, both for Matthew and for the Harris family, who had waited far too long for this opportunity. When the initial contact phase concluded, the clearest realization was not a sense of completion, but the awareness that confirming the identity only opened the first door of a long journey, where the truth needed to be delivered, not at the speed of investigation, but at the pace of human beings, and where reunification, if it occurred, would have to be built on a foundation of understanding, preparation, and mutual respect. The confirmation of Matthew Harris's identity, through biological evidence, did not immediately lead to a face-to-face meeting, because the entire process at this point had to shift from the logic of investigation to the logic of human protection, where every step of approach carried the risk of causing harm, if not tightly controlled. The initial contact with Matthew was designed as a strictly supervised process involving psychologists, social workers, and legal representatives to ensure that the approach did not create sudden shock or a sense of violation for an individual who had lived fully for many years under a different identity. The goal of this phase was not to reconfirm the identity, which had already been scientifically proven, but to assess Matthew's current psychological state, understand how he perceived himself, his living environment, and the relationships around him, and thereby determine his level of readiness to receive information that could upend the entire foundation of his life. The experts approached Matthew in a neutral role, unconnected to the investigation or the missing person past, to avoid triggering suspicion or defensiveness, while observing how he responded to general questions about his life, early memories, and sense of belonging. In this process, the lack of immediate recognition became a key factor, as Matthew showed no signs of awareness that he knew or suspected his true identity. All his responses were consistent with someone who believed his current life was self-evident, with no gaps needing explanation. This lack of recognition was not seen as an obstacle, but as critical data that helped the experts understand that revealing the truth required careful preparation to avoid causing a severe identity crisis. The psychological assessment of Matthew revealed an individual highly adapted to his current environment, with stable social connections and no clear signs of trauma related to disrupted memories, a positive signal of resilience, yet also a major challenge for the reunification process, as any abrupt intervention could shatter that fragile balance. In that context, supervised contact aimed not only to protect Matthew, but also to preserve the integrity of the future reunification process, preventing a moment that should be healing from becoming a long-term traumatic experience. The initial contact sessions were structured along a gradual pathway, where information was shared indirectly, focusing on feelings of safety, trust, and the ability to handle change, rather than diving straight into the core issues of identity or biological family. The psychological evaluation in this phase was not intended to diagnose or label, but to identify protective factors and risks, thereby developing an approach plan suited to Matthew's own pace, rather than imposing expectations from the system or the biological family. The lack of immediate recognition also reflected an important reality. For Matthew, the concept of being missing did not exist in his personal experience, and therefore being found did not carry the meaning of liberation that society or the media typically imagine. This forced the participants to adjust their perspective, recognizing that reunification was not a single event, but a complex psychological process that needed careful preparation from both sides. During the initial contact phase, the experts also began preparing for the possibility of reunification by assessing Matthew's potential reactions to information about his biological family, not to predict specific emotions, but to determine the level of support needed when the truth was revealed. This preparation included developing different approach scenarios, from introducing the concept of a biological family in an abstract way to gradually connecting Matthew to his past story, always prioritizing psychological safety. Throughout the entire process, patience became the core principle, as any attempt to rush risked breaking the newly formed trust, not only between Matthew and the experts, but also between Matthew and his own life story. Initial contact therefore did not produce explosive moments or intense emotions as often expected in reunification stories, but unfolded quietly, slowly, and under control, reflecting respect for an individual who had lived many years unaware that he was the center of a long-running case. The preparation for reunification in this phase did not aim to guarantee a perfect outcome, but to minimize as much as possible the risk of secondary trauma, both for Matthew and for the Harris family, who had waited far too long for this opportunity. When the initial contact phase concluded, the clearest realization was not a sense of completion, but the awareness that confirming the identity, only opened the first door of a long journey, where the truth needed to be delivered, not at the speed of investigation, but at the pace of human beings, and where reunification, if it occurred, would have to be built on a foundation of understanding, preparation, and mutual respect. The prolonged and cautious psychological preparation in the initial contact phase eventually led to the moment when the entire system clearly recognized that keeping Matthew in a state of safe waiting could not continue indefinitely, and family reunification had to be implemented as a controlled transition that was both humane and legally responsible. Organizing the reunification was not viewed as a single emotional event, but as a carefully designed process in which every decision aimed to minimize the risk of secondary trauma for Matthew while protecting the Harris family from psychological shock that could arise when reality did not match the vision they had built over many years. The reunification location was chosen based on neutral criteria, familiar to Matthew but not tightly tied to old memories or institutional authority, to avoid him feeling as though he was being handed over or placed in an uncontrollable situation. The timing was also carefully considered to ensure Matthew had sufficient mental preparation without being rushed by investigative schedules or media pressure. Participation in the reunification meeting was strictly limited to only those truly necessary to keep the space safe enough for emotions to emerge without being amplified or judged. Parallel to the organizational work, complex legal issues began to be addressed systematically, because confirming biological identity did not mean that all prior legal ties automatically ended. Matthew had lived for many years under a different identity, with established legal rights and obligations, and transitioning to the identity of Matthew Harris needed to be done carefully to avoid creating legal gaps or a sense of lost autonomy. Legal authorities, social services, and family representatives coordinated to resolve each layer of issues, from temporary guardianship and residency status to adjusting related administrative records, always centering on the principle of the best interests of the child. The legal resolution process did not aim to create an abrupt break from Matthew's previous life, but rather a transitional pathway that allowed him to maintain stability in daily activities, education, and social relationships while procedures were completed. In that context, restoring identity became a multi-layered process, both technical and deeply psychological, because returning the name Matthew Harris was not just amending documents, but introducing a new, or more accurately, interrupted, aspect of identity into his current life. The experts chose a step-by-step approach, allowing Matthew to gradually become familiar with his real name, biological history, and family ties, rather than requiring him to immediately abandon the identity tied to all the memories that had shaped his personality. This helped reduce the risk of an identity crisis, while letting Matthew build connections between his current self and the newly revealed past at a pace suited to his own capacity. As legal barriers were gradually removed, and the biological identity was recognized to the necessary extent, the official family reunification took place within a tightly controlled framework, where emotions were allowed to exist, but not pushed to overwhelming levels. For the Harris family, the moment of seeing Matthew again was not the outburst they had imagined during years of waiting, but an experience blending deep emotion, restraint, and even confusion, because the child they found was no longer the 6-year-old from their memories, but a person who had grown up with a distinct personality, habits, and worldview. For Matthew, the meeting did not carry the usual meaning of returning home, but was the first direct contact with a biological family he had no attached memories of, causing feelings of connection and strangeness to coexist in the same moment. That overlap of emotions meant reunification could not be understood as a complete ending, but as the starting point of a long-term adaptation phase. The process of readaptation was implemented as an inseparable part of reunification, with ongoing support from psychologists to help Matthew process the complex emotions related to having more than one history, more than one family frame of reference, and sense of belonging. The Harris family also had to undergo profound adjustment, learning to build a relationship with Matthew based on who he is now, rather than the frozen image of the child in their memories for many years. This required them to accept that love and attachment could not be resumed immediately, but needed to be rebuilt from scratch in a completely different context. Readaptation occurred not only on an emotional level, but also practically, as Matthew needed space to maintain the relationships formed in his previous life, while gradually becoming familiar with his new role in the biological family, without feeling forced to choose or abandon part of himself. Clear boundaries were established to ensure that reunification did not become pressure, and that Matthew had the right to decide his level of involvement in family life at each stage. Throughout this process, patience remained the key factor, as any attempt to accelerate risked breaking the newly built trust, making Matthew feel compelled to meet others' expectations. Family reunification, therefore, was not seen as a moment that fully released years of pain, but as a new journey where all parties had to learn to live with the truth, with irreparable gaps, and with a future that had no clear shape yet. Legal resolution, identity restoration, and the start of readaptation proceeded in parallel, forming a transitional structure that allowed Matthew to be recognized as Matthew Harris, both biologically and legally, while still being respected as an individual, with the right to choose how he stepped into the next chapter of his life. As the reunification process unfolded, what stood out most was not the feeling of closing a long-running cold case, but the realization that returning home, in this case, was not going back to the starting point, but jointly building an entirely new foundation. Where the past was acknowledged but not imposed, the present was protected, and the future was opened cautiously, humanely, and with long-term responsibility from everyone involved. Matthew's reunification with his biological family, though profoundly meaningful on a human level, did not mean that every question in the case had been closed, because behind what seemed like a complete outcome, there remained a dark area of legal and investigative matters still unclarified. The perpetrator behind Matthew's disappearance many years earlier had not yet been officially identified, not due to a lack of suspicion, but because the chain of events occurred in a context lacking direct evidence, prolonged time, and systemic gaps that caused many important traces to fade or never be recorded. The fact that Matthew lived for years under a different identity raised core questions about the role of individuals who participated in or allowed that situation to happen, but moving from ethical suspicion to criminal liability was far from simple within the current legal framework. Certain individuals who appeared in the early stages of the story, despite behaviors or decisions that raised questions, had not been prosecuted, not necessarily because they were innocent, but because the existing evidence was insufficient to meet the standard of proof required in court. Suspected individuals, in this context, existed as names outside the scope of prosecution, as time had faded memories, erased physical evidence, and created gaps that inference could not fill. The inability to clearly identify a perpetrator was not just a failure of a specific investigative phase, but the accumulated result of many factors, from an initial response that was not comprehensive enough to the lack of linkage between data systems and the limits of traditional investigative tools. The gaps that allowed the case to drag on for years did not lie in a single point, but spanned from the individual to the structural level, where each decision reasonable at the time stacked together created an irreversible chain of consequences. The fact that Matthew could exist in society without being detected as a missing child reflected a troubling reality about how the system prioritized administrative validity over the ability to detect complex exceptions. These gaps, though identified after the case was reopened, could not yet be fully remedied within the current legal framework, as they involved how data was collected, shared, and used across agencies with different functions. The limitations of traditional investigation were also clearly exposed throughout the process, as methods relying on statements, crime scenes, and behavioral inference proved powerless against a scenario that did not follow familiar criminal logic. The absence of clear signs of violence, no secondary scene, and no prominent suspect caused the initial investigation to quickly reach its limits, forcing the case into cold case status without enough data to go further. Even when DNA genealogy opened a new path and led to confirming Matthew's identity, it could not automatically resolve questions of criminal responsibility, because DNA in this case served to confirm a person rather than a criminal act. The gap between biological truth and legal truth thus persisted, creating a gray area where justice, in the traditional sense, had not yet reached. The fact that suspected individuals had not been prosecuted also reflected the necessary caution of the justice system, as any legal action lacking solid grounds risked serious error, especially in a case that had already endured prolonged harm. However, this caution simultaneously raised the question of whether current tools were sufficient to handle complex cases where the truth only emerged after many years and no longer fit familiar investigative patterns. The unresolved issues were not only about who bore responsibility, but also about how the system learned from its own failures, because if the gaps that once allowed the case to drag on were not fixed, the risk of recurrence in other cases remained. The Harris family, though reunited with Matthew, still had to live with the feeling that the story was not truly closed, because their son's return was not accompanied by a complete explanation of what happened and why it could last so long. For Matthew, the lack of a clear conclusion on responsibility also created a cognitive gap, where he knew he had lost many childhood years, but had no clear framework to understand the deeper causes of that loss. The unresolved issues were therefore not only legal questions, but also ethical and societal ones, posing a challenge to how the community viewed the concept of justice in long-running missing person cases. The limitations of traditional investigation, when looked back upon, were not meant to blame specific individuals or units, but to clarify that tools once considered sufficiently powerful were no longer suitable for the complex scenarios of modern society, where identity could be altered and data fragmented across systems. Acknowledging these limitations was the first step toward improvement, but it could not immediately provide answers for Matthew's case, as what had passed could not be fully recreated. In that state, the case existed with two parallel conclusions: a humane conclusion, where Matthew was found and reunited, and an incomplete investigative conclusion, where the perpetrator had not been identified and responsibility had not been assigned. This very parallelism created a sense of incompleteness, not due to lack of effort, but because the truth had outgrown the system's ability to resolve it fully within the given time frame and conditions. The unresolved issues thus became an inseparable part of the story, reminding us that not every case labeled solved brings a feeling of complete closure, and that sometimes justice exists in an imperfect form, where the best that can be achieved is minimizing damage and learning from what could not be fixed. The unresolved issues that remained after Matthew's return meant that reviewing the entire case could not stop at the emotion of reunification, but had to place this story within a broader picture, where every phase, every decision, and every gap contributed to shaping the final outcome. From the moment Matthew disappeared, the initial response of the family and community, the peak investigation period, the shift to cold case status, the long years of silence, and finally, the technological turning point, the case's progression clearly reflected how an incident could slip out of the system's control without ever disappearing from real life. Summarizing the entire process shows that this was not a failed case in the simple sense, but a chain of efforts, limited by the era's context, where the available tools at each point were insufficient to resolve a complex scenario that fell outside traditional investigative patterns. Matthew's return was not the result of a single action, but the late convergence of accumulated data, quiet perseverance, and a fundamental shift in approaching identity issues. In that overall picture, the role of modern technology emerged as the decisive factor, not because it completely replaced human effort, but because it allowed people to see connections previously obscured by time and data fragmentation. DNA genealogy did not solve the case in the traditional sense, but it opened the only path capable of breaking the prolonged deadlock, proving that even when memories fade and physical evidence disappears, biological traces can still exist as a guiding thread. Technology in this case did not operate independently, but only became effective when placed within an investigative framework, willing to learn from past failures, ready to change assumptions, and accept that answers might lie outside what was once considered reasonable. Evaluating the investigative system through the lens of Matthew's case revealed strengths and weaknesses existing side by side, where individual dedication did not always compensate for structural limitations. Gaps in data cross-checking, lack of interconnection between agencies, and the tendency to freeze files when clear leads ran out all contributed to prolonging the disappearance, even though they did not stem from malice or indifference. At the same time, that very system demonstrated the ability to self-correct, as it eventually agreed to reopen the file, apply new technology, and bring a cold case thought to have sunk into oblivion back into the light. This raises an important question about how society defines solved in criminal cases, because in this instance, confirmed truth did not come with clear criminal accountability, but existed as a form of incomplete justice. The significance of the Matthew Harris case for other cold cases, therefore, lies not in providing a simple formula to resolve every missing person incident, but in expanding the mindset about the possibility of victims surviving after many years, and the role of technology in breaking old assumptions. It shows that classifying a case as cold should not mean stopping asking questions, and that data once deemed irrelevant can take on entirely different meaning when revisited in a new context. At the same time, the case also emphasizes the importance of building early detection mechanisms and cross-data verification to minimize the chance that a child could legally disappear within the system without being detected. For the Harris family, summarizing the case did not bring a feeling of complete closure, but a transformation from a state of waiting to facing a reality far more complex than they had ever imagined. Matthew's return was undeniable, but the lost years and unanswered questions remain part of the story. For Matthew, the case closed in terms of identity, but opened on a personal level, as he had to learn to live with two intersecting life streams, and define for himself the meaning of the newly revealed truth. From a societal perspective, this story became a powerful reminder that cold cases do not always end in death or failure, and that patience combined with innovation can yield results beyond expectation, even if delayed. The summary of the Matthew Harris case, therefore, does not aim to provide a neatly closed conclusion, but to mark the end of a long investigative chapter, while simultaneously opening another about how the system, technology, and people can learn from what happened. In that context, this case stands as a typical example, showing that justice does not always arrive in perfect form, but continuing to search, continuing to ask questions, and continuing to improve the system still carry deep meaning, not only for those directly involved, but for all the cold cases lying silently, waiting for a chance to be revisited through the eyes of a new era. The story of Matthew Harris directly reflects many very real-world issues in today's American society, where technology advances faster than the way people and systems learn to use it in a synchronized and responsible manner. First and foremost, the biggest lesson lies in absolute faith in validity on paper. In the story, Matthew was able to grow up for many years under a different identity, simply because administrative records appeared valid. Schools and healthcare accepted him like any other normal child, and the systems never cross-checked. This reminds us that in real life, from schools and hospitals to government agencies, caution should not stop at sufficient paperwork, but should include a mindset of asking questions when unusual gaps appear, especially involving children. Second, the story shows the value of quiet perseverance. The Harris family never stopped considering Matthew missing, even as society and the system gradually forgot the case. In American life, where the pace is fast and attention is easily scattered, this emphasizes that unresolved issues, from missing persons and abuse to injustice, do not disappear simply because we stop talking about them. Third, the fact that DNA genealogy became the turning point shows that technology only truly matters when people are willing to change their approach. The technology existed, but it was not until the cold case unit dared to revisit old data with new thinking that Matthew was found. The story teaches that reunification is not an ending, but the beginning of long-term responsibility. The family's responsibility to respect Matthew as he is now, the system's responsibility to fix its gaps, and society's responsibility to learn how to protect the most vulnerable before they disappear from our sight. If you believe that every unresolved cold case deserves another chance to be revisited, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following stories that have truly changed people's lives. Thank you for listening to the journey of Matthew Harris, and see you in the next video, where the truth, even when it arrives late, still deserves to be told.